Few films have earned their place in comedy history the way this one has. Built on a shoestring budget with no studio willing to take a chance, Monty Python and the Holy Grail somehow became one of the most beloved comedies ever made. And the real story behind it is almost as absurd as the film itself. Every iconic moment was born from desperation, freezing conditions, and decisions that had no business working. From crumbling castles to costumes barely holding together, the whole production was one bad day from complete collapse. But before any of that could happen, someone had to actually fund it, and the people who stepped up were the last ones anyone expected. Number 1. Rock stars saved this film. When every major studio passed on the project, the six Pythons found themselves with a brilliant script and absolutely no money to make it. Traditional film financiers had little interest in a low-budget medieval comedy from a sketch group, no matter how popular their television show had been. The doors were closing fast, until help came from a completely unexpected direction. It turned out that Britain's biggest rock stars were devoted fans of Monty Python's Flying Circus, and several of them were eager to put their money behind the film. Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, and Jethro Tull were among the acts whose members invested in the production. Their backing wasn't purely financial, it came with genuine enthusiasm for the Pythons' brand of humor, and that made all the difference when it came to creative control. Because the funding came from fans rather than studio executives, the Pythons were free to make exactly the film they wanted. There were no executives demanding script changes or safer jokes. Without that unlikely coalition of rock royalty, one of comedy's greatest films might never have existed at all. Number 2. The cold that made the film look real. Scotland in the early spring is not exactly known for warm, welcoming weather, and the cast and crew discovered that the hard way. Filming took place across various Scottish locations, including Doune Castle, and the conditions were relentlessly harsh. Cold rain, biting wind, and muddy terrain became a constant backdrop to every scene shot outdoors. The actors were dressed in heavy costumes that quickly absorbed the Scottish rain, turning already uncomfortable outfits into exhausting burdens. Despite the misery, the performances had to continue, and many scenes required repeated takes in weather that made every moment on set a genuine challenge. Ironically, the suffering served the film beautifully. The muddy, bleak landscape gave the production a visual texture that no studio set could have replicated. The cold grey skies and battered terrain made the medieval world feel unexpectedly authentic, which made the comedy land even harder against such a serious backdrop. Sometimes the worst conditions produce the best results. Number 3. That armor was actually knitted wool. One of the most persistent myths about medieval films is that they require enormous costume budgets to look convincing. This production had no such luxury, and the wardrobe team had to get extremely creative. What most viewers assumed was heavy, authentic-looking armor was actually something far more inventive. Much of the armor worn throughout the film was constructed from knitted wool, carefully painted and treated to mimic the appearance of metal on camera. The costumes were designed with a specific understanding of how light would interact with the material, creating a surprisingly convincing illusion. What looked solid and weighty on screen was often flexible and lightweight in reality, though the Scottish weather quickly changed the lightweight part. Rain and cold caused the knitted costumes to absorb moisture and grow progressively heavier as filming days wore on. Actors who started the day in manageable outfits were often struggling under the added weight by afternoon. The fact that this detail remained invisible to audiences for decades is a testament to the skill of the costume designers, who built a medieval world out of wool, paint, and sheer resourcefulness. Number 4. The coconuts were always the joke. Few gags in film history have been as instantly recognizable as the sound of coconuts being clapped together to simulate a horse. For a production that couldn't afford real horses in many scenes, it was a practical solution, but it was also something far more deliberate. The Pythons didn't stumble onto the joke by accident. They embraced it with full awareness of exactly what they were doing. British comedy had a long tradition of absurdist sound gags, particularly through radio programs like The Goon Show, which had pioneered the use of ridiculous effects for comedic purposes. The Pythons grew up on that tradition and understood precisely how an audience would react to having the trick pointed out rather than hidden. Instead of quietly using the sound effect and hoping no one noticed, they made the coconuts themselves the centerpiece of the joke. By turning a budget limitation into an on-screen punchline, the filmmakers demonstrated a comedy instinct that went beyond simple necessity. What could have been an embarrassing workaround became one of the most quoted moments in the entire movie, and it has never stopped being funny. Number 5. A 98% tax rate funded this movie. Britain in the early 1970s had one of the most punishing tax environments in the developed world. At the highest end, marginal income tax rates reached as high as 83% on earned income, with an additional surcharge on investment returns that could push the effective rate to 98%. For high earners, including the very musicians who had grown wealthy during the rock boom of the previous decade, simply holding on to money had become an enormous financial challenge. Investing in British film production offered a legitimate and widely used route around this burden. Under the tax rules of the time, losses on qualifying film investments could be offset against income, meaning that backing a film which failed commercially was, from a purely financial standpoint, not necessarily a disaster. The money committed by the rock industry backers was structured in a way that made the investment as much a tax strategy as a creative bet. What this meant in practice was that the film attracted funding it would never have found through conventional channels. The Pythons weren't considered a safe commercial proposition, but that almost didn't matter. Supporting an unconventional and creatively ambitious project carried far less financial risk than it appeared on the surface. Number 6. One castle played every kingdom. Location budgets were brutally tight, and traveling between multiple sites across Scotland would have consumed money the production simply didn't have. The solution was both practical and quietly impressive. A single location, Castle Down in Stirlingshire, was dressed, reframed, and repurposed to serve as several entirely distinct settings throughout the film. What appears on screen as a varied medieval world of separate strongholds and kingdoms was, in reality, the same building photographed from different angles. The craft involved in pulling off that illusion was considerable. Directors Terry Gilliam and Terry Jones worked closely with their camera team to ensure that each scene felt visually distinct despite sharing the same physical space. Shooting from low angles, adjusting what appeared in the background, and carefully controlling which parts of the structure were visible, all contributed to maintaining the deception. The approach also had an unexpected creative benefit. Because the team knew the location intimately by the time later scenes were filmed, they could make quick decisions and adapt efficiently when conditions changed. What began as a cost-cutting measure quietly became one of the production's more elegant pieces of problem-solving. Number 7. Some nights shared a single costume. Some of the film's most memorable characters were built around visual details that cost next to nothing, but even those modest resources had to be managed carefully. Certain night costumes existed in only a single version throughout the entire shoot, meaning that if a particular outfit was needed in a scene, only one actor could wear it at any given time. For a production built around an ensemble of performers who frequently appeared together, this created scheduling puzzles that required constant attention. The logistics demanded a level of coordination that wasn't always easy to maintain in the field. Stand-ins were occasionally used for wider shots where fine costume details were less visible, and clever staging allowed the filmmakers to suggest the presence of fully costumed characters without always showing them directly. None of this friction is visible in the final cut, which is a genuine achievement given how chaotic the conditions could be. The film moves with a confidence and consistency that suggests everything was carefully planned from the start, when the reality was often the opposite. Number 8. Nobody agrees on what it cost. Even decades later, pinning down exactly how much the film cost remains surprisingly difficult. Different sources have quoted different figures over the years, and the confusion isn't simply a matter of poor record-keeping. It reflects a genuine complexity in how the production was financed and how costs were distributed across different stages. The number most commonly cited sits somewhere between £229,000 and £300,000, but neither figure tells the complete story. Part of the discrepancy comes from the gap between the initial investment raised through the rock industry backers and the total expenditure by the time the film was finished. Post-production costs, including Terry Gilliam's animation sequences and the work required to bring the film to a releasable standard, added expenses that weren't fully captured in early budget summaries. The confusion eventually became woven into the film's mythology in a way that almost felt appropriate. A production this chaotic, this improvised, and this reliant on creative workarounds probably deserved an origin story that was equally difficult to pin down. Number 9. Everyone raced for the hot water. When the cameras stopped rolling each day, a different kind of competition began. The accommodation available to the cast and crew during the Scottish shoot was basic by any standard, and the hot water supply at most locations was extremely limited. After long days in cold, wet conditions, the prospect of a warm shower was one of the few genuine comforts available, and there was rarely enough of it to go around. The race to claim a spot in the queue became an unofficial daily ritual. The broader picture of life on set during that shoot was one of consistent physical discomfort. Between the weather, the terrain, the demanding schedule, and the lack of basic amenities, the production asked a great deal of everyone involved. What's striking in retrospect is how little of that exhaustion damaged the chemistry on screen. The performances remained sharp, the comic timing precise, and the energy between the cast consistently alive despite everything working against them off-camera. Number 10. Their army was just local students. Creating the impression of a large medieval army is the kind of challenge that defeats low-budget filmmakers regularly. Crowd scenes require bodies, and bodies cost money. The solution found here was as resourceful as almost everything else about the production. Local university students were recruited to fill out the backgrounds of key scenes, providing the visual scale the story required without the expense of hiring professional extras. The recruitment process was relatively informal and the compensation modest, but students turned out to be enthusiastic participants. They brought energy to the set, followed direction well enough for background work, and were available in reasonable numbers at short notice. The filmmakers made smart use of staging and camera placement to maximize the impression of scale. On screen, the illusion holds convincingly. Scenes that appear to show substantial forces assembled in the landscape read as genuinely populated rather than thinly staged. The film didn't need a cast of thousands, it just needed to look like it had one. Number 11. Historic sites kicked them out. Not every problem on this production could be solved with quick thinking and a camera angle. One of the more significant setbacks came when permission to film at certain historic locations was withdrawn before the shoot had fully gotten underway. Access that had been assumed or informally agreed upon was suddenly no longer available, leaving the team scrambling to find alternatives at short notice, with very little room in the budget to absorb the disruption. The reasons behind the restrictions were largely connected to concerns about damage to protected historic structures. Scotland's castles and ancient sites carry significant cultural weight, and the relevant authorities were not always comfortable with a film crew operating around irreplaceable stonework. What the loss of those locations forced was a creative recalibration that ultimately served the film well. Castle Down stepped in to fill multiple roles precisely because other planned locations had fallen through. Sometimes the best creative decisions aren't made freely. They're made because everything else has already been ruled out. Number 12. Two directors who couldn't agree. Sharing the director's chair is an arrangement that rarely goes smoothly, and this production was no exception. Terry Gilliam and Terry Jones split the directing responsibilities between them, with Gilliam handling the visual and compositional elements, while Jones focused more closely on the performances of the cast. In theory, it was a sensible division of labor. In practice, the overlap between those two areas created friction that ran as a constant undercurrent throughout the entire shoot. The disagreements were genuine and sometimes heated. Jones and Gilliam had fundamentally different instincts about how scenes should be framed and paced, and reconciling those instincts under the pressure of a tight schedule and deteriorating weather was not a straightforward process. What emerged from that tension, though, was something more interesting than what either director might have produced alone. Gilliam's visual inventiveness and Jones's instinct for performance pushed and pulled against each other in ways that sharpened both. The friction, exhausting as it was, left its fingerprints all over the finished film in the best possible way. Number 13. Lost Gilliam animations, found decades later. Terry Gilliam's cutout animation sequences are among the most distinctive elements of the film's visual identity. Immediately recognizable, wildly inventive, and unlike anything else in mainstream cinema at the time. What fewer people know is that additional animation material was later discovered, surfacing years after the film had already cemented its place in comedy history. The recovered material offered a fascinating glimpse into how the animated dimension of the film had originally been imagined. Some of what was found showed ideas developed to a reasonably advanced stage before being set aside, while other fragments were clearly earlier explorations that didn't survive the editing process. The discovery added another chapter to a film that had never really stopped generating new conversations. Decades after its release, the existence of unseen material reminded audiences that the version they knew and loved was the product of significant creative editing, and that somewhere in the margins of the production, other possibilities had existed. Number 14. The credits were the first joke. Opening credits exist, in most films, as a formality, a necessary preamble to be endured before the story begins. This film had other ideas entirely. The title sequence opens with what appears to be a straightforward set of credits, accompanied by dramatic orchestral music. before gradually revealing itself to be something else altogether. The text begins to include increasingly ridiculous additions, fake Scandinavian translations, absurd acknowledgements, and escalating digressions, until the credits themselves are interrupted and shut down by an unseen authority figure. The comedy of the sequence depends entirely on its commitment to the setup. It begins with just enough straight-faced formality to let the audience assume they're watching conventional credits, then escalates the absurdity at a pace carefully calibrated to catch people off guard. As a statement of intent, it remains one of the most elegant and purely funny title sequences ever assembled. It signals immediately that the filmmakers are in full control of their comedy, that nothing on screen should be taken at face value, and that the conventions of filmmaking are themselves fair game. Number 15. The score was stolen from a library. The music that runs beneath the action has a quality that most viewers would assume came from a specially commissioned composer working closely with the production. Grand, sweeping, and almost absurdly serious in tone, it functions as a perfect comedic counterpoint to the chaos it accompanies. The reality behind it is considerably more practical. Much of the soundtrack was sourced directly from stock library recordings, licensed material acquired at a fraction of the cost of original composition. The decision was driven by budget constraints, as so many decisions on this production were. What the team discovered was that the right library music, serious, dramatic, and performed with complete conviction, actually served the comedic purpose better in many respects than something written specifically for the film might have. The gap between the grandiosity of the music and the absurdity on screen was a joke in itself. The result was a film whose sonic world feels entirely coherent and intentional, despite being assembled largely from pre-existing recordings. It's one more example of this production taking a limitation, refusing to apologize for it, and finding a way to make it work harder than the obvious solution would have. Number 16. Even the nicest Python snapped. Among the 6 Python members, Michael Palin had long carried a reputation as the most even-tempered and approachable of the group, the one least likely to lose his composure under pressure. That reputation made what happened during one particularly grueling stretch of the Scottish shoot all the more striking. The conditions had been relentless for days, the schedule was slipping, and the combination of cold, exhaustion, and repeated takes finally pushed even the calmest man on set past his limit. The specific circumstances involved a scene that required multiple attempts under conditions that were already physically demanding. Wet costumes, uncooperative weather, and the accumulated fatigue of weeks on location had stripped away the buffer of patience that normally kept things civil. When the frustration finally broke through, it reportedly caught the rest of the cast and crew genuinely off guard. What the incident revealed was something important about the broader human reality of the production. The polished performances that survived the editing process represent only the best of what was captured during a genuinely difficult shoot. The fact that Palin, of all people, reached a breaking point is perhaps the clearest evidence of just how demanding the whole experience really was. Number 17. The subtitles are full of hidden jokes. Home video releases opened up a dimension of the film that cinema audiences never had access to, and one that a surprisingly large number of even devoted fans have never fully explored. When the film was released on home formats, subtitle tracks were included that went well beyond transcribing dialogue for accessibility purposes. These alternative tracks contained additional jokes, sardonic commentary, and running asides that operated as a second layer of comedy entirely independent of what was happening on screen. The approach was entirely consistent with the Python sensibility, the idea that no surface, no format, and no convention should go unexploited as a potential vehicle for comedy. The subtitle humor worked best for viewers who discovered it unexpectedly, suddenly realizing mid-scene that the text at the bottom of the screen had stopped reflecting what the characters were saying and had started doing something else entirely. Many people have watched this film a dozen times in various formats without ever activating the relevant subtitle options, meaning the extra layer of comedy has been sitting there, largely unnoticed, for years. For those who do find it, it feels less like a bonus feature and more like a secret left deliberately in place by filmmakers who trusted that someone, eventually, would look. Number 18. Censors almost killed a key scene. Not everything in the finished film arrived there without a fight. Several sequences attracted serious attention from censorship bodies during the classification process, with regulators expressing concern about content they felt pushed against the boundaries of what was acceptable for a general theatrical release. The film's willingness to engage with religious themes in a comic register was a particular flashpoint. territory that classification boards in the mid-1970s were inclined to treat with considerably more caution than audiences ultimately proved to require. The Pythons were not new to this kind of institutional friction. Their television work had generated complaints and regulatory scrutiny on multiple occasions, and they had developed a robust approach to defending their creative choices when challenged. The arguments made on behalf of the film emphasized the satirical intelligence behind the material, points that carried enough weight to preserve the sequences in question, though not without negotiation. The controversy around the film's content, rather than damaging its prospects, became part of the cultural story surrounding its release. Audiences who heard that censors had nearly intervened arrived with heightened curiosity, and the sequences that had attracted scrutiny were often precisely the ones that generated the biggest reactions in theaters. Number 19. A real historian inspired a running gag. Not every joke in the film was born from pure invention. One of the more layered gags, the recurring appearance of a modern historian who provides earnest academic commentary on the medieval events unfolding around him, had a specific real-world inspiration. The character drew directly from the conventions of serious historical documentary filmmaking, the kind that was widespread on British television during the 1960s and 1970s, and that audiences would have recognized immediately. The joke operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, it's a parody of documentary conventions, the authoritative expert, the sober delivery, the implicit claim of academic credibility. Beneath that, it's a commentary on the relationship between history as it is told and history as it actually was, gently suggesting that the confident certainties of academic narration might be no less absurd than the chaos they're attempting to explain. The character's eventual fate within the film's story is one of the more genuinely surprising comic pivots in the entire script. A moment where the film collapses the boundary between its medieval fiction and its modern framing device in a way that nobody who hadn't seen it would anticipate. Number 20. The King Arthur you never knew was struggling. Behind the commanding screen presence of King Arthur lay a personal story that was significantly more complicated than anything visible in the performance. Chapman, who carried the central role throughout the film, was quietly dealing with a serious dependency on alcohol during the production period, a struggle that had been developing for some time, and that was, by the time cameras rolled in Scotland, affecting him in ways the cast and crew could not always ignore. The physical demands of the shoot, cold locations, long days, uncomfortable costumes, and a schedule that left little room for recovery, intersected badly with what Chapman was going through personally. There were days when his condition made certain scenes more difficult to execute than they should have been, and the people around him had to adapt accordingly. What remains remarkable is the quality of the performance Chapman delivered despite everything. His Arthur is precise, committed, and genuinely funny in ways that required real skill and timing under any circumstances, let alone the ones he was actually facing. He sought help for his dependency in subsequent years and spoke openly about that period of his life before his passing in 1989. Number 21. The Killer Rabbit came from medieval art. It arrives without warning, a small, white, and apparently harmless creature that turns out to be one of the most lethal things the knights encounter on their entire quest. The Killer Rabbit scene has become one of the most quoted moments in the film's legacy, but the inspiration behind it reaches further back than most viewers realize. Medieval manuscripts and illuminated texts frequently depicted rabbits in surprisingly aggressive and violent contexts, a recurring motif in Gothic art where the natural order was inverted for comic or satirical effect. The creative team tapped into that tradition deliberately, grounding what could have been pure randomness in something with genuine historical texture. The practical execution relied on straightforward but effective methods, a real rabbit, careful camera work, and reaction performances that committed completely to treating the animal as a genuine threat. What has kept the scene so deeply embedded in popular culture for 5 decades is the perfection of its internal logic. Within the world the film has constructed, where nothing behaves as expected and danger arrives from the most unlikely sources, a murderous rabbit is not a contradiction, it's a natural conclusion. Number 22. They ran out of money before the ending. Few endings in film history have generated as much discussion as this one, and the debate is particularly interesting once you understand how it actually came to exist. The original vision for the climax was considerably more ambitious, involving a large-scale battle sequence outside a castle that would have brought the quest to a dramatic and suitably chaotic conclusion. The money ran out before it could be filmed. By the time the production reached the point where the battle sequence needed to be shot, the budget had been pushed to its absolute limit. Rather than attempt a diminished version of the original idea, the decision was made to abandon the planned ending entirely and replace it with something that turned the limitation itself into the joke. The arrival of modern police officers to shut down the medieval action was not the product of a long creative process. It was born from financial necessity in a very short period of time. The result, entirely by accident, became one of the most celebrated aspects of the whole film. By breaking the fictional frame so completely and so abruptly, the ending captures something essential about the Python approach to comedy: the willingness to demolish a carefully constructed setup rather than deliver a conventional payoff. Number 23. The scene that was too dark to keep. Every film carries the ghost of material that didn't survive to the final cut, and this one is no exception. Among the sequences that were developed and partially realized before being set aside was a scene involving a prince locked in a tower. Content that pushed into territory the filmmakers ultimately felt sat uneasily alongside the rest of the film's humor. The decision to remove it was made in the editing process, where the tonal balance of the whole became clearer. The nature of what was cut touches on themes that would have introduced a different kind of comedy into a film otherwise built around medieval absurdity and satirical wordplay. Without that material present, the film maintains a consistency of tone that allows its specific brand of humor to breathe without interruption. The existence of that cut material serves as a reminder that the film audiences know is the product of significant editorial decision-making. The choices made about what to leave out were as important as the choices about what to keep. The best editing is always invisible, and this particular removal contributed, quietly and without acknowledgement, to the final film's enduring coherence. Number 24. Knee came from a real person. Some of the most memorable comic inventions have their roots in ordinary, unscripted moments, and the distinctive battle cry of the knights who say knee is a perfect example. The word itself, delivered with maximum aggravated intensity by a group of knights who use it as their primary weapon, reportedly traces back to a real person from the Python's social circle, whose particular pronunciation of a common word struck the group as inherently and irresistibly funny. The sound lodged in someone's memory and eventually found its way onto the page. The process by which real-life observations become scripted comedy is rarely straightforward, and the Pythons had always drawn heavily on the texture of everyday life for their material. Voices, mannerisms, institutional absurdities, and social conventions all fed into the work constantly, filtered through the group's collective sensibility and sharpened into jokes that felt both recognizable and completely unhinged. The scene itself works because of the absolute commitment with which it is performed. The premise, that a particular sound holds genuine power over those who hear it, is delivered with complete seriousness by everyone involved, which is precisely what makes it so funny. Number 25. Why it still makes new audiences laugh. Half a century after a group of rain-soaked comedians charged around the Scottish Highlands on an imaginary horse, the film they made continues to reach new audiences with a consistency that very few comedies from any era can match. Theatrical re-releases have brought it back to cinema screens on multiple occasions, introducing it to generations who weren't born when it first appeared. Home formats, streaming platforms, and the circulation of clips across digital spaces have kept it in constant cultural conversation. The legacy extends well beyond the screen. Spamalot, the stage musical adapted from the film, ran for years on Broadway and in the West End, winning major awards and introducing the story to audiences who encountered it first as theatre rather than film. Merchandise, academic study, and the film's deep penetration into the shared vocabulary of comedy writers and performers across multiple generations have all contributed to a cultural footprint that bears no relation to the modest budget on which the whole thing was built. What the film's endurance ultimately demonstrates is that the ingredients of lasting comedy have nothing to do with resources and everything to do with intelligence, commitment, and a willingness to follow absurdity wherever it leads. Every limitation the production faced became an opportunity, every setback a creative prompt. From rock stars writing checks to coconut shells standing in for horses, from knitted armor to an ending born entirely out of financial desperation, every corner of this production tells the same story. The people who made Monty Python and the Holy Grail had almost nothing to work with, and they turned that almost nothing into one of the most enduring comedies ever committed to film. Limitations didn't diminish the vision, they sharpened it. What makes the film's legacy genuinely remarkable is that none of it was supposed to happen. No studio believed in it, the conditions worked against it at every turn, and the budget ran out before the ending could even be filmed properly. And yet here it is, 5 decades later, still making new audiences laugh just as hard as the first ones did in 1975. If this look behind the scenes added something to your appreciation of the film, show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives like this one. And let us know in the comments, which of these secrets surprised you the most?